So futurists generally say that there are multiple scenarios possible ahead. Certainly there are scenarios in which life goes very well, but equally there are scenarios in which we take our eyes collectively off the ball and we get impacted badly by one or other global catastrophic risks. So what we can see with the pandemic, it's a wake-up call. It's a rehearsal for humanity to realize, actually, we have made some bad choices. We don't have sufficient resilience in society. We're not agile enough. We've been prioritizing some of the wrong things. We haven't built the right institutions to fight this kind of risks wisely enough. And as a result of this, some people say it's almost like World War III, except it wasn't the World War III we were expecting. I've heard futurist Nell Watson, for example, speak in these terms recently, and it's a bit of a shocking idea, but when you think about it, there is some merit to it because the world is going to probably have its worst economic depression since at least the 1930s and possibly for several centuries. And we have to look at each of the world wars and say, well, what happened at the end of the World War? Of course, it was terrible during the war. What happened afterwards? And at the end of the First World War, it was actually a real mess. The countries imposed punitive restrictions on each other, lots of financial penalties, and there was some initiative to create a League of Nations, but it was half-hearted and didn't really work. After the Second World War, things in many ways were better. Out of the great disaster of the many millions of people who died, tens of millions of people who died, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a very good document for its time. There were international institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and there were investments in the so-called Marshall Plan, in which the defeated countries were no longer subject to punitive reparations. They were actually economically helped by the victors. So now, as we come out in due course of this other lockdown and coronavirus crisis, we have to decide, how are we going to act? Are we going to try and punish countries and leaders who made mistakes, or are we going to put in place structures, principles, processes, perhaps a new declaration of rights, which will stand as well for the 21st century?
We are in, we're living in a global world, and whether that means the fact that we can communicate like this, or the fact that, the supply chain, and everyone's talking about the supply chain these days, and, and if we'd, been more self-reliant, I mean, this is the talk today in the United States, both on the left and on the right, progressive and conservative, is, but the threat, even though they're coming from these different ideological places, the sort of takeaway is, we should be more insular. We should be more self-reliant. And again, it promotes this idea of exceptionalism or nationhood and so on. How do you, there are obviously a lot of lessons that can be learned. And I guess one other piece to this, and it's funny that you say the world wars, because obviously as the First World War ended, there was the Spanish flu, which killed many more people, 100 times more people than the actual First World War killed in its totality. So, and we didn't learn anything from that pandemic. So I have thoughts about this. I think optimistic or semi-optimistic or thoughts around this. What makes you so sure that we're going to learn well, I'm not saying that you're social, but what I imagine that you hope, like me, that we're going to learn the right lessons as opposed to the wrong lessons, which some of the ones are being talked about, which is, I think, becoming more insular or more, and maybe there's a thread that sort of takes the self-resilience, but also expands it in terms of the world in which we live. I don't know. So what are your thoughts around this?
Great questions. And one of the mistakes, as it were, of coming out of the Spanish flu was that nobody talked about the Spanish flu. It was sort of covered up in many parts of the world. It was viewed to be demoralizing. And so people were aware that it had happened, but it was not written into history books. There were no flu poets as there were war poets. There was no great protest movements against the flu as there were protest movements against the war. It was sort of removed from the public awareness. Hence, now people are so shocked that it killed, people say about 100 million in some estimates, which was, as you say, quite a lot more than the actual First World War conflict had killed. So it was a mistake to cover it all up, and we should have learned from our failures. After all, that's one of the great messages of businesses of all sorts, and indeed of life. Don't run away from your failures. Don't cover them up. Figure out how you can fail smart, fail forwards, and see what needs to be done differently. And if you don't look at it carefully enough, if you try and hide it away, you likely will draw the wrong lessons. And you were very interesting when you said that there is some movement towards self-reliance and some movement towards insularity, some movement towards putting up more borders. Well, I think we can have more self-reliance, but we should not have more insularity. We should keep communicating. We should realize that we can solve problems better together than trying to all solve them individually. Many of the problems we face as a planet and many of the opportunities can only be addressed by global action rather than each country trying to work it out by themselves. So self-reliance means that when there are shocks, then localities are still able to continue. So it does make sense to bring some manufacturing locally, which can be done, by the way, by automation more. So instead of relying on human workers on the other side of the planet, countries will be able to rely more on automation locally. So figuring out what are the real lessons is going to require an open discussion. It's going to require transparency. It's going to force us to move away from blaming and tribalism. It's going to demand the best of us. And if we don't let these better aspects of our nature come to the fore in this discussion, we may well learn the wrong lessons. And it may be like the First World War over again, in which the current crisis sets the seeds, sadly, for an even worse crisis to come.
I assume that you believe that there's enough voices that we're going to learn the right lessons. And my thought is that as much as it is going to be really tough, it's particularly because this recession is going to be, I believe, going to be, terrible for a lot of people, everybody really, but for certainly people who've been marginalized and there isn't well, for a whole bunch of reasons, there's a lot of people who are going to really suffer. But my thought is that we are going to learn the right lessons. What voices or things have you heard or seen of late that allows you to feel like we are going to learn the correct lessons rather than the wrong lessons, as we have done with various things through our history?
Well, I still can't take anything for granted. I think the current situation could get a lot worse. It could get a lot worse if the virus spreads more widely and completely overruns the health systems, which so far have been overstretched in some parts of the world, but not yet widely. So it could get worse in that aspect. It could also get worse if some politicians try to deflect blame for their mishandling or perceived mishandling and indulge in overseas adventuring. That has often been the case in the past. So you can imagine there might be, I don't know, a power vacuum in North Korea. If it turns out that there is some trouble with the regime there, it might be a conflict with Iran. There could be some other part of the world where things go unexpectedly, and then various political leaders who are unstable or uncomfortable might lash out, and we might plunge the world into an even worse state of chaos than at the moment. So I can't take it for granted, but here's what I like about your question. You're asking what are the positive signs we can look at. Well, we have many governments which are actually behaving quite well in the process. I particularly like what's happening in New Zealand. I like what's happened in Taiwan and Vietnam and South Korea. They're strong democracies, by the way, with vibrant, especially in South Korea and New Zealand and Taiwan, there's a strong tradition of multi-party states. So they have managed to listen to science. They have managed to coordinate big social response. There are many countries in Europe that have done better than others. I look at what Greece has done. I look at what's happening in Austria and the Czech Republic. In various ways, they have handled the situation pretty well. Germany has had more deaths, but has also handled things quite well. So there is a variety of countries where, although things are bad, they're not as bad as elsewhere. And in these countries, there is still broadly a positive, constructive public dialogue rather than which is in some other parts of the world getting in the way of some honest, constructive discussion.
Is there any particular, I mean, what's interesting, one of the things that kind of makes me smile is, well, the fact, all the sort of I mean, because FM had his own verbiage, and it was, but his second book was all about this, was teleeducation, telecommunication, telemedicine, and it's taken a global pandemic to put those things at the forefront when really all those things have been available for quite some time. But it does make me laugh that in some ways, you know, his prediction that this was going to be so commonplace in terms of how we educate our children, or we educate ourselves, but also how we approach medicine. Are there any other, but it's taken a global pandemic to make that an emphasis. Are there other things that, whether it was FM or other things that people were proposing or thinking that they would become mainstream, that, number one, would have been more helpful in this current situation, or in situations that we can imagine might happen that you think we've sort of overlooked?
Well, we touched on the idea already of universal basic income, which for many people just seemed a utopian fantasy. But last week, I think in Britain, 100 politicians from almost every opposition party came together to ask for a recovery universal basic income. So this idea has moved much more into the mainstream. Andrew Yang, the Democratic candidate for a while for president, did a lot to popularize this idea, but it has been this crisis which has led more people to realize maybe the way the social contract is set up is no longer truly fit for purpose. Maybe we shouldn't be encouraging everybody to go out and work as quickly as possible. Maybe it makes more sense to provide at least a basic income for people, and that we should be prioritizing ensuring that people who don't work can have a good quality of life nevertheless. So that idea has come along in leaps and bounds as well. We're going to move away from cash probably as well, much more quickly as a result, because more shops are saying, don't give us cash, cash dirty, you might spread the germs with cash, or coins indeed, or coins or notes. And so increasingly we're going to move to contactless payments, digital currencies of various sorts. That's another thing that's accelerating. And then there is automation. Many firms have been a bit slow and reluctant to adopt automation because they have thought it's better to keep humans in the loop. But now with many humans understandably being reluctant to work in close proximity to each other, more companies are thinking, let's hurry up and adopt the right kind of automation. And they're now much more vigorously discussing which types of AI are for real and which are just empty hype. And although a lot is empty hype, a lot of it's for real too.
There are all these things that are coming down the pipeline that are becoming so much more mainstream that gives you some indication that we are going to learn some positive lessons.
It's still part of the same pattern, that the shock to the system is accelerating changes which have long been foreseen, but didn't have enough momentum hitherto.
In the short term, what are the big things that we expect to see if one looks at this in an optimistic way, in terms of what are some of the things that you think as a futurist that we will achieve not just as a result of this pandemic, but just in terms of things that are coming online that will bring us closer to FM's vision of 2030, or indeed your vision of the future?
So the first thing is that ideally scientists will be raised up in public awareness and public respect. science will offer reliable guidance as to the likelihoods of various treatments working or not. Science will get more funds allocated to it so we can be faster to either producing a vaccine or some other cure. It might be transferring the plasma from cured people or people who are immune to others. So the first thing I look forward to is the growth in respect for scientists, provided the scientists practice the proper scientific attitude, which is one of open-mindedness, testing their theories, and peer reviews. So that's the first thing I look forward to. The second thing I look forward to is a desire to address global issues with global conversations rather than retreating into isolationist, and that more funds will be provided as to the organizations like the WHO. Certainly the WHO can in some aspects be criticized for its response to this, but it was underfunded. It maybe didn't have all the right management in place, and it's by no means the only international organization that needs to be put in place. And so there will be greater attention to global threats and also global possibilities, and we will transcend just our national thinking. So that's the second thing I would like to come to this. And the third thing, I would like to see more people say all lives are precious. Now, we could have come out of the pandemic by saying, you know what, it's mainly only old people who are going to die. Let's not turn the economy upside down just to help these very old people. We should let them die. Actually, there are some people who say that, but thankfully it's very much a minority. Instead, there is a re-expression of the sanctity of life and the re-expression that everybody should have a good chance of good health. That's far better than just saying, let's keep the GDP high. So I want to see more focus on human values rather than, let's say, consumerist goals. So these are the three things which I think together can help us transition into a much better future. There can be a great reconsideration, if you like, which will help to accelerate a change which should have happened already, which is a change towards a transhuman society and transhuman people within that transhuman society worldwide, with nobody left behind.
I was going to say amen, but it seems a bit anachronistic. But yes, here, I hope so, definitely.
I think amen means so be it. So that's no direct religious implications of that particular word.
I know, but there's a connotation anyway. But yes, so be it. So that's amen, I will say to that. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time and doing this. And thank you, and we'll stay in touch, hopefully. And hopefully you can, hopefully all these things are going to happen. Or at least some of them, in the good ones, hopefully.
We'll make them happen. It's down to us, you and me and everyone else.